In 1985, a child walked down to the creek and never came back. No scream, no struggle, no sign of a vehicle on the road or a mark in the grass. The only thing left behind was silence and a family that would never be the same. But before any of that, she was just a little girl in a red dress whispering secrets to a handmade doll sewn by her grandmother. And the last time I saw her, she waved to me like she always did, 2 fingers and a crooked grin just before she slipped behind the cornfield. That's the moment I go back to most, because even then, something about that day felt off. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments, and if stories like this have ever passed through your town or your life, tap like and subscribe. Every click helps bring a name like Rebecca's back into the light. My name's Sarah Granger. I was 38 that fall, living just down the road from the Miller farm outside Greenfield in Lancaster County. Out here, we don't talk much about the past unless it's useful. But I'm telling this now because I don't think silence ever did anyone any good. Greenfield was one of those places that seemed untouched. You'd wake up to the sound of horses pulling wagons, roosters calling across the fields, children playing barefoot in the yard. No electricity, no radios, no noise except the wind and your own thoughts. The Millers were good people, quiet, honest, rooted. Their daughter Rebecca was 6, bright-eyed, polite, a little shy unless she knew you. She had that doll with her always red cotton dress, black yarn hair. Her grandmother had sewn it from old apron scraps. I remember once she told me it wasn't just a doll, it was a listener. That Tuesday in October started like most days did. The morning was cool and damp mist rolling low across the hayfields. You could smell wood smoke on the wind. Mary was in the kitchen early making oatmeal. Daniel was already in the barn before sunrise. Rebecca helped with the breakfast table like she always did, humming a hymn I didn't recognize. I remember glancing out my kitchen window around 9 a.m. and seeing her walking toward the creek. Barefoot, same as always. Doll tucked under her arm. That image, her small figure disappearing into the tall grass behind the Miller property, stayed with me long after I stopped believing she'd come back. It was one of those days where everything looks right but feels wrong. The wind died down. The chickens were quiet. Even the dogs weren't barking like usual. And around noon I stepped onto my porch just as Mary rang the old dinner bell, a big rusted thing Daniel mounted years ago. The sound carried clear across the valley. I remember setting my tea down listening, waiting to hear the patter of Rebecca's feet through the grass. But it didn't come. That was the first moment it hit me that something had gone deeply, terribly wrong. Mary didn't wait long after the dinner bell before stepping off the porch. She called Rebecca's name once, twice, voice sharp with confusion, but not yet fear. I saw her walk past the fence line with a dish towel still clutched in her hand, the wind catching the hem of her apron. From my own kitchen window, I watched her make her way toward the back field, toward the trees where the creek curled through a patch of overgrown grass and smooth stones. It was a little girl's spot. Quiet. Familiar. She'd played there 100 times. But the look on Mary's face as she crossed the pasture that day, that was different. By the time I stepped outside and called out, she didn't answer, just kept walking. I threw on my boots and headed after her, not running, just moving fast enough that my heart noticed. I caught up right before she reached the water. It was calm, no splashing, no sound, but the creek sliding over rocks. We both scanned the area waiting for that voice, that laugh, that child scolding tone kids use when they think grown-ups have interrupted their game. But it didn't come. What we found instead was a pair of small footprints in the mud. They led down to the water's edge, right to where the bank dipped, then stopped. No scuff marks, no drag, no other set of prints, just Rebecca's. And her doll wasn't there. That's when I saw Mary's hands start to tremble. She knelt near the footprints, touching the soil as if she could will some answer out of it. I kept looking around into the trees along the creek back toward the field, and then I turned and ran. I sprinted back to the miller's barn, waved down Daniel, and told him he needed to come now. Something wasn't right. Within 10 minutes he was on horseback shouting to neighbors. Word spread fast in our community, it always has. Greenfield might be small, but when something goes wrong, people show up. By late afternoon, there were more than 40 of us combing the area. Amish men on foot and horseback English neighbors with radios and pickup trucks, a few from town, who'd brought dogs and a thermal scope, not that it helped. There was no trail to follow. Just a small cap or prayer covering caught on a fence post almost 2 miles off, torn and stained with something dark. Someone drove it straight to the sheriff's office in Lancaster. They sent it off for testing, but we wouldn't know anything for days. That night, the Miller house stayed lit by lanterns long past the hour any of us usually turned in. I brought a stew over, but no one touched it. Mary sat in Rebecca's room, the doll's usual spot on the bed, now empty, the covers smoothed out like she was waiting for someone to lay down and pick up where they left off. Daniel paced the porch. He wasn't a man who raised his voice, but I heard it crack once through the screen door, something about roads and strangers, and a truck no one could seem to agree on. When the police finally came out, Lancaster City officers, not local deputies, they didn't quite know what to do with us. No electricity meant no cameras. No telephones meant no call records. Our way of life didn't leave a digital trail. It left what the earth kept: footprints, fibers, gaps in sound. One detective, a man named John Harrison, took the lead. He was calm, respectful, asked a lot of questions, and listened to answers that didn't always help. Rebecca wasn't the kind of child to wander far. She didn't talk to strangers. She didn't play in the road. Her school teacher came to speak with Harrison, too, said Rebecca was always careful, always polite. The kind of girl who stood when spoken to. But there were rumors. 2 neighbors, both reliable, said they'd seen a dark-colored pickup near the creek that morning. One said blue, one said black. One said the driver was a man, the other swore it was a woman. No one saw anyone get out. No one saw anyone speak to Rebecca. But the truck didn't belong to anyone in our community, and no one local would have passed that way without waving or stopping to say hello. That much we knew. 3 days passed. No ransom call. No sightings. Just dead ends. Until that phone call out of Philadelphia. A woman's voice. Said she'd seen a girl who matched Rebecca's description in her neighborhood. Even mentioned the red dress and the black yarn hair details the police hadn't shared with the public. Harrison moved fast. He and another officer drove out the same day, but by the time they got there, the caller was gone. The address she gave didn't exist. It was a fake name, fake number, nothing to trace. That shook people. Someone out there knew what Rebecca was wearing. Someone knew about the doll. The following week, the news stories slowed down. Other cases took the headlines. But the Millers kept going. Daniel worked the fields with his sons like always, though he barely spoke. Mary walked the property every morning, following the same path her daughter had taken sometimes twice a day. She left small pieces of bread at the fence post where the cap had been found, as if Rebecca might come back and need something to eat. Winter came early that year. The creek froze in November, solid and silent under a layer of snow. Search teams dwindled. Volunteers had to return to their own lives. The last organized sweep happened right after New Year's. After that, the file went into storage. Harrison told me quietly that he still looked at it every month. But cases go cold faster than people realize. By March of 1986, the Miller family stopped speaking publicly. The bishop asked the congregation for prayers, but no one mentioned Rebecca's name aloud anymore. It was like she'd been folded into the silence that comes with grief too big to name. I stayed close to Mary those next few months, helped with laundry, watched her boys when she needed to walk alone. But nothing filled that space, not even the hope that maybe somewhere Rebecca was still alive. That kind of hope takes on a sharp edge when you start asking who might have known when you weren't looking. Who might have been watching? It would be years before we got any kind of answer. But even then, what came next wasn't closure. It was a question dressed up like a child's toy, a red cotton dress, black yarn hair, and a story no one was ready to hear again. When the frost settled in that winter and the fields went still, so did the momentum of the search. Folks from town stopped calling. The state officers assigned to the case were rotated out one by one, and Harrison, the detective who'd stayed on longer than most expected, stopped showing up on Sundays. I remember the day the file got pulled from his desk. He didn't announce it or complain. He just drove out one last time, sat at the Miller's kitchen table for nearly an hour, and told Mary and Daniel he was sorry. Then he folded the photo of Rebecca back into its file, pressed the clip closed, and said he'd keep it with him anyway. That was the kind of man he was. But after that, things got quieter. Not just in the house in town, too. The silence turned heavier. It stopped being about hope and started being about keeping it all from falling apart. Still, Mary wouldn't let it go. She stayed in touch with the department, made calls through the English neighbors when she needed to, sometimes even wrote out to the post office in Ronks to send letters. She collected every article that mentioned missing children, whether they were in Pennsylvania or Idaho. If a girl was taken from a bus stop or a fairground, she clipped the report. She watched for phrases, red dress, black yarn hair, Amish clothing, anything that might match. But most of the time there was nothing. Just a headline, then silence. Then came the tips. Dozens of them. Someone claimed to see Rebecca at a gas station outside Columbus. Another woman in Jersey swore she saw a child who looked just like her at a shopping mall carrying a doll with no face. Each one sent a ripple of something like urgency through the house. The first time a deputy called with one of those leads, Mary packed a bag. Daniel hitched the wagon and drove her into town without a word. But they always came back alone. Either the child in question turned out to be someone else, or the sighting led nowhere. And after a while, even the calls started sounding tired, like the dispatcher didn't believe them but had to go through the motions. There was one tip that stuck out. It came from Philadelphia, a woman who called the police line late at night. She gave a name turned out to be fake, and said she saw a little girl walking near a grocery store who matched Rebecca's description exactly. Down to the red dress. Down to the doll. That detail had never been shared with the public. Only the family and the investigators closest to the case knew about it. That doll was one of those things you don't mention in interviews, a detail you hold back so you can spot the difference between someone trying to help and someone trying to lie. When the officers got to the address she gave, there was nothing there. No child, no woman, no record of the number she called from. It rattled people, especially Harrison. He was still checking in occasionally, and I remember him saying, low and tired, "Someone out there knows more than they should." That changed the tone. After that call, the family started wondering if someone close to the investigation was talking. Not intentionally, maybe, but leaking details. A neighbor who overheard too much, a relative repeating something they shouldn't have, or someone far worse. Because if the caller wasn't bluffing, then it meant Rebecca's doll had been seen, held, described, which meant Rebecca might have been seen too. By then, the community had pulled in tight. Children were walked to school in pairs. Some families stopped attending events outside Greenfield. Church elders reminded people to avoid outside media. There was a worry unspoken but present that the English world wasn't just dangerous, it was watching. Watching us. Watching them. The Millers changed in ways that didn't show unless you were looking. Mary still cleaned Rebecca's room once a week, dusted the shelf, folded the quilt, never opened the dresser. She kept a tin box under her bed where she stored letters, old photos, a pressed flower Rebecca had given her once. Daniel kept working the land, took to long walks out by the fence line at dusk. Sometimes I'd see him standing there after sundown, hat in his hands, staring out over the back pasture like he was waiting for something to return. The bishop came to speak with them that spring, encourage them to make peace with God's will. That was the phrase used. Make peace. Mary nodded, but I could tell she wasn't ready. That kind of peace felt too much like surrender. The outside world moved on. News outlets shifted to other cases, missing children with louder stories or newer photos. But in Greenfield, Rebecca's absence hung in the air like smoke that hadn't cleared. Everyone had their own version of what they thought might have happened. Some whispered about that truck again, the one spotted near the road. Some believed it was someone from the outside passing through. Others thought it had to be someone local, someone who knew when the Millers wouldn't be watching. That's the thing about a community this small. When something terrible happens, the question turns inward. People stop asking where and start asking who. But when Mary did try to speak to press for new leads to request the FBI take another look, the answer was always some version of the same. We've done everything we can. We have no new evidence. Unless something turns up, there's nothing more we can do. She wasn't angry. Not outwardly. But after each of those calls, she grew a little quieter, a little more measured in how she spoke. And I think in a way the silence around her became a kind of armor. It kept her from falling apart in front of her boys. It kept her moving. But I could see the toll. And sometimes I wondered if what hurt most wasn't the loss, but the feeling that no one outside our town believed the full weight of it anymore. And still the red doll never turned up. No one mailed it anonymously. No child was found holding it. It wasn't left at a station or folded into some charity bin. For 9 years it was like it vanished along with her. Like the doll had absorbed whatever final truth existed and taken it with her into the dark. Except that's not what happened. Not forever. Because one day, almost a full decade later, it came back. And not in the way anyone expected. It came quietly, tucked between a quilt and a jar of homemade jam on a folding table at a farmer's market. Worn, yes, but still whole, still red, still waiting. And with it came a story that none of us were ready to hear. Not then. Not ever. It was early September when the doll surfaced again. 9 years had passed since Rebecca disappeared, and to most of the world her case had long since gone cold. But those of us who'd lived through it, who'd stood in those fields, who'd watched Mary ring that dinner bell every single day for weeks after, well, we hadn't moved on. We'd just learned how to carry it without showing the weight. I remember that Sunday morning clearly. It was still warm enough for short sleeves, and the market in bird in hand was humming like usual people milling around folding tables covered in jars of apple butter quilts hung like tapestries in the breeze, hand-carved toys stacked in neat little rows. It was a place you went when you wanted to feel something familiar. But that day, it's where everything began to unravel again. Her name was Helen Kaufman. She lived 2 towns over and had a habit of collecting antique dolls. The real kind, the ones with hand stitching and fading fabric, the ones that weren't meant to be bought from stores. She told me later she hadn't been looking for anything in particular that day, just browsing, until she saw it. A small cloth doll with a faded red dress and black yarn hair sitting quiet among the soaps and preserves on a modest Amish vendor's table. Something about the pattern of the stitching caught her attention. She didn't recognize it from memory exactly. It was more like a gut feeling, a visual itch. But when she picked the doll up and turned it in her hands, the shape of the arms, the way the seams curled at the shoulders, she knew. She didn't say anything right away, just smiled politely, asked the older woman at the stall where the doll had come from. The vendor gave her name as Ruth Stoltzfus, said she was selling off some items her late sister had made seamstress work mostly. Dolls' bonnets, little aprons. Ruth looked nervous, Helen said. Polite, but rehearsed. The story didn't hold under scrutiny. Helen noticed small repairs on the doll that used newer thread than the rest of the stitching. And the yarn hair had been rebraided not recently, but not 9 years ago either. This was a doll someone had been caring for, not just storing. That alone would have been strange. But when Helen got home and pulled out the newspaper clippings she'd saved from the mid-'80s, She'd followed the case back then. She matched the description word for word. Red homespun dress, black yarn hair, hand-stitched, no face. Her hands were shaking when she called Lancaster County PD. That call landed on the desk of a young detective named Sarah Chen. Cold Case Unit. She'd only been in the department a little over a year, but I heard later she took one look at that doll and cleared her schedule. She drove out to meet Helen in person. They photographed the doll, took DNA swabs, checked for fibers. It might have been nearly a decade since Rebecca disappeared, but forensic science had moved forward, and Chen intended to squeeze every answer she could out of that toy. 3 weeks later, the results came back. Rebecca's DNA was on the dress fragments in the fibers embedded in the seams, like a fingerprint only time could bury. That should have been the big discovery. But it wasn't. The real shock came when the lab found a second DNA profile, one they couldn't identify. It didn't belong to Helen. Didn't belong to Ruth. And it wasn't some old contaminant either. The sample was relatively fresh. Maybe 2-3 years old. That doll had been handled, played with, possibly slept with, by someone new. And still no record. No match in the database. That's when Detective Chen went back to speak with Ruth again. She didn't come at her angry, just clear. Asked to talk inside. Said they could drink tea while they spoke. Ruth agreed. Invited her in. But as Chen later told me, she noticed right away how jumpy the woman was. Kept glancing toward the door, fidgeting with her hands, offering explanations before questions were even asked. At first, Ruth stuck to her story about the doll coming from her sister's belongings. But when Chen pulled out the lab report, laid it gently on the table between them and said, "Ma'am, your fingerprints are on this, and so are the fingerprints of a child who hasn't been seen since 1985. Ruth changed. She went quiet for a long while. Then she wept. Not the kind of crying that asks for comfort. The kind that comes when you realize you're in far deeper than you meant to be. Through those tears, she gave up the real story. The doll hadn't come from a box in her attic. A woman had brought it to her stall 3 months earlier. Middle-aged. Plain clothes, not Amish, but modest. Said the doll belonged to her daughter and needed repairs. Paid $50 cash, well above what it was worth. Then she asked Ruth to sell it at the market once the repairs were done. Said her daughter had outgrown it and wanted to pass it along. Ruth didn't ask questions. She just did the work. She remembered the woman clearly. Brown hair, pulled back, quiet voice drove an older model pickup. Ruth described her as soft-spoken but strange, like someone trying to fit into a setting that didn't belong to them. When Chen brought out a photo lineup, women from the area who had been involved in the case in any way, Ruth pointed to one almost immediately. She wasn't completely sure, she said, but the face felt right. It was a woman named Margaret Brennan, a name most folks hadn't heard in years. She'd been a social worker back in 1985, had volunteered during the initial search, helped organize community outreach. Seemed helpful at the time. Kind. The kind of woman who brought coffee to the command tents and played with the younger siblings while parents gave statements. No one had ever considered her a suspect. Why would they? She was part of the effort to find Rebecca, or so we thought. Chen didn't jump to conclusions. She pulled Brennan's personnel file, cross-checked her addresses over the years. She'd moved twice since the 80s, but never left the county. Lived now in a small farmhouse outside Willow Street, about 30 minutes from Greenfield. No kids, never married, still working peripherally in community programs, mentorships, outreach, volunteer training. Nothing that required a license anymore, but enough to stay close to families. Too close, maybe. Chen drove by the house more than once before making contact. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. Neat yard, shutters painted light blue. But in the backyard, just barely visible over the hedge, was a small structure. Not a shed, not a garage, something smaller, brightly painted, tucked between flower beds. A playhouse. Inside they would find far more than toys. But that moment hadn't come yet, not officially. At that point, all Chen had was a doll, a name, and a gut feeling that something had been festering under the surface for a very long time, and it was almost ready to split wide open. Detective Chen didn't rush the search. She knew that without cause, even the strongest suspicion wouldn't hold. But after Ruth Stoltzfus identified Margaret Brennan from the photo array and the forensics confirmed Rebecca's DNA on the doll alongside the unknown second profile, Chen had what she needed. Still, before she approached Brennan directly, she spent 3 more days watching that house. Just her and a borrowed county cruiser parked off a gravel pullout 300 yards up the road. She watched the lights go on and off. Watched Brennan carry groceries to the side door, sometimes pausing at the gate to adjust her collar or brush hair from her eyes. At one point, she came out back to water the garden, just ordinary movement. Except in the middle of the vegetable rows stood the playhouse. Closer now, Chen could see that it was more than decorative. Someone had gone to great effort to keep it clean. Curtains in the window. Toys inside. A row of painted handprints along the lower trim. They looked small, deliberate, almost ceremonial. There were 5. Chen didn't know what they meant yet, but she wrote it down. On the 4th morning, a warrant was signed. Search and seizure. Property, electronic devices, any rooms designed for a child. They brought 2 cruisers and a plainclothes unit from the county. When they knocked, Brennan opened the door without hesitation. She wasn't startled, wasn't panicked. She didn't even ask why they were there. She just looked at Chen, then at the officers behind her and said softly, "I suppose this is about the doll." The front room was clean, quiet. Floral upholstery, old family photos, a shelf of books with creased spines. Nothing out of place. Chen moved through the home, carefully documenting everything. But it wasn't until they reached the basement that things began to shift. The staircase was narrow, unfinished wood, the kind that creaks even under light steps. At the bottom was a painted door, light pink with a brass knob worn smooth from use. Brennan stood at the top of the stairs and said nothing. When Chen opened the door, the air hit different. Not musty, not foul, just still. Like a room that had been used often, then sealed shut. Inside was a child's bedroom. Quilt small bed dolls lined up neatly against the wall. Not just 1 or 2, a full dozen, each handmade. Some newer than others, but none like Rebecca's. There were drawings pinned to the walls, crayon sketches of trees, a dog, a little girl in a bonnet. Names weren't signed. But Chen took each one, carefully placed them into evidence sleeves. On the nightstand sat a small Bible. Beside it, a cracked plastic cup filled with artificial daisies. The bed itself was made. Not neatly, but recently. The pillow had an indentation in the center. Someone had been sitting there. Brennan offered no resistance during the search. She followed them from room to room like a guest in her own house, hands folded gently, eyes down. When she was brought in for questioning, she didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't ask for water. She just sat straight backed across the table from Chen and waited. The confession came slowly, not because she was hiding it, but because she told it the way someone recites scripture, fixed, memorized, deeply believed. She said she'd first seen Rebecca at the market that spring, months before the abduction. The Millers were there selling butter and preserves, and Rebecca had wandered off briefly to sit in the grass. Brennan had noticed the doll before she noticed the girl. She called it a sign. Said she'd always wanted a daughter but couldn't have children. That she believed God had placed Rebecca in her path for a reason. The way she spoke, it was less like a kidnapping and more like a rescue, at least in her mind. Chen didn't interrupt much. She let Brennan talk even when the timeline began to twist. Brennan said she watched the Miller property for weeks, knew Rebecca's routine, knew when her brothers left for the fields, when Daniel was in the barn, when Mary turned her back to prepare breakfast. On the morning of October 15th, she parked a half-mile from the edge of the woods and waited. When Rebecca approached the creek, she stepped out and called to her, told her that her mother was hurt and needed help, said the girl didn't hesitate, just followed, took her hand. Brennan paused here. Her voice dropped. She said she didn't mean to frighten her, that Rebecca had cried the first night but eventually calmed down. She'd prepared a room-clothes books, meals made from old recipes. She'd even enrolled her in a school briefly under a different name. But Rebecca wouldn't adapt. She cried every night, refused to eat, clutched her doll and asked for her mother. Brennan said it wore her down, that she thought given time Rebecca would settle into the life she'd imagined for her. But then the child got sick. Fever. Cough that wouldn't go away. It was mid-November by then. Brennan was terrified to bring her to a hospital. She feared questions, recognition. So she kept her home. Used cold cloths, store-bought cough syrup. Nothing worked. On November 15th, exactly 1 month after she was taken, Rebecca died in that basement bed. Brennan said she held her through the night waiting for the fever to break. But it never did. She buried the body herself, wrapped her in a quilt and carried her out past the tree line behind the garden, dug the grave beneath a fallen log. But she couldn't part with the doll. Said it was all she had left of her girl. For years she kept it on the shelf, braided its hair, repaired the seams. And when the guilt began pressing down, when the memories sharpened instead of softened, she brought the doll to Ruth. Said it was time for it to go. She didn't want it anymore, but she couldn't throw it away. So she let someone else do it for her. The room was silent after the tape stopped. Chen didn't speak for a while. She just sat there watching the screen flicker with the last frame of Brennan's face. And then she stood up quietly and walked down the hall to inform the recovery team where to start digging. The site was exactly where Brennan described. Shallow grave beneath a log split by age and rot. The quilt had nearly disintegrated, but remnants of the fabric matched the ones from the basement. Skeletal remains. Small. Fragile. Dental records confirmed what they already knew. It was Rebecca. And yet, even with all the answers, there were things that didn't settle. Things left hanging in the air too soft for a file report, but too loud to ignore. Why now? Why give up the doll after 9 years? Why return it to a community still carrying that wound? And perhaps most haunting of all, what made her stop. Because for all that Brennan said, and all that she claimed to believe, it was clear to everyone who'd sat in that room, she wasn't finished. The hardest part to understand was how still she stayed while telling it. Brennan never raised her voice, never stumbled, never flinched when she named what she'd done. It wasn't bravado. It was something quieter and somehow more troubling, like she'd rehearsed this version of events for years and couldn't let herself waver from the script. But not everything she said fit neatly into that version. And as the days passed, we started seeing the places where her story frayed. After the recovery team confirmed the remains in the woods were Rebecca's, there was a stillness in the station that didn't lift. We'd found her. We had the confession. But nothing about it felt complete. Brennan claimed to have acted alone. No help, no accomplice. Said she planned it in isolation, carried it out quietly, and covered it up the same way. And for a while, that was accepted on paper at least. But in the interviews that followed, in the quiet hours when she spoke to prison staff, to court-appointed psychologists, small details began to surface. She talked about Rebecca like she was still alive. Not in a ghostly sense, but like she hadn't left. She hated canned peaches, she told one nurse. I stopped buying them. And to another, she mentioned a blue dress Rebecca liked to wear in the spring, even though she'd only had her for a month, and the weather that year had already turned cold. None of that made sense. There were inconsistencies in her timeline, names she mentioned that didn't appear in any case file locations, that didn't match where she claimed to have been during certain weeks in 1985. Detective Chen went back through the original reports. Every page. She reread the interview logs from the day of the abduction, looked at patrol routes, community volunteer lists, donation ledgers from the search efforts, anything that might put Brennan somewhere she didn't belong. And that's when she noticed something odd. There was a flyer dated October 17th, 2 days after Rebecca disappeared. It listed the names of people who'd helped organize meals for the search volunteers. Each entry had a contact number. Most were local. But one name written in different handwriting than the rest didn't have a number beside it. Just the word drop-in. The name was Amy Lester. It didn't mean anything at first. No connection to the Miller family. No church record. No address. But Chen found the flyer in a storage folder Ruth had given them left over from the town's initial search efforts. And when she cross-referenced that name with Department of Human Services records from the mid-'80s, she found something else. Amy Lester had been listed once briefly as a live-in caregiver for a juvenile recovery home in Ohio. That home, it turned out, had shut down the same year Brennan left her position as a social worker. It was enough to raise flags. So, Chen pulled Brennan's full employment record. Not just the years she worked for the state, but her volunteer history community outreach notes, even her applications. And buried in a scanned intake form from 1984 under references was the same name, Amy Lester. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone Brennan had worked with, maybe trusted, maybe more. At that point, the case had technically closed. Brennan had confessed, been charged, and was already in county custody awaiting sentencing. But Chen pushed for further investigation. She requested visitation logs from the prison, asked the state forensic lab to rerun the unknown DNA found on the doll against expanded profiles, pushed for follow-up interviews with Brennan's previous co-workers, and gradually a different picture began to take shape. There were families, 3 in particular, who recalled Margaret Brennan staying involved after her assigned cases had closed. She'd bring toys, send letters, ask to check in long after her official role had ended. Most chalked it up to her being overly invested, maybe a little lonely. But in retrospect, the visits felt more calculated. One mother remembered Brennan showing up unannounced on her daughter's 8th birthday. Not empty-handed, with a doll, handmade, red dress, black yarn hair. The mother had never reported it, just thought it was strange. The daughter didn't keep the doll, said it made her uncomfortable. They donated it to a thrift shop a few weeks later. And still, even with all that information, Brennan refused to admit anything beyond what she'd already confessed. She stuck to her version of events: 1 child, 1 month, 1 grave. She insisted she'd acted alone and that returning the doll was her way of letting go. But Chen didn't buy that. Neither did I. If she truly wanted to disappear from the story, she could have burned that doll, buried it, let it rot in her attic. But she didn't. She repaired it, cleaned it, paid a stranger to pass it along, and in doing so reopened the wound. By early spring, Brennan was moved to state prison. A psychiatric evaluation recommended placement in a facility with long-term observation. She'd started showing signs of delusion, speaking to people who weren't there, referring to children by names that didn't match any records. She told one officer without prompting that she'd let Rebecca go, but still had more work to do. The prison logs started tracking her behavior hourly. But none of it changed what had already happened. The grave behind the house had been marked "The remains returned," and the Miller family finally had a place to mourn. Mary asked for privacy. Daniel never made a statement. They held a quiet service, just family, just the community. No reporters, no cameras. The casket was wooden, simple, unadorned. Mary placed a folded quilt on top. Not the original, a new one. Bright red, stitched by hand. For the first time in 9 years, the town felt still again. But it wasn't peace. It was pause. Because the doll wasn't the only thing Brennan had held on to. And Rebecca, we were learning, wasn't the only child she had tried to bring home. The official sentence came down on a gray morning in April. Margaret Brennan was given 15 years kidnapping, child endangerment, involuntary manslaughter. She didn't contest the charges, never once stood to deny what she did. And in that way it felt simple, measured. But the simplicity didn't sit right with anyone close to the case, especially not Detective Chen. There was too much that didn't add up. Too much that didn't line up cleanly with how a person acting alone could carry this kind of story for nearly a decade, much less decide one day to let go of the only object tying her to what she'd done. The doll was the question that wouldn't go away. Not just that she kept it, but how she cared for it, maintained it. And then, after all those years, chose to let it surface in the one place where it would be recognized. Chen said later she believed that decision wasn't guilt, it was control. A way of telling the story on her terms. One last attempt to shape how Rebecca would be remembered. In the months that followed, Brennan began her sentence at a medium security facility 2 counties west. It wasn't long before the reports started coming in notes from staff psychologists, intake officers, guards. She was polite, compliant, quiet, but detached. She had no visitors, no letters. And still she spoke about Rebecca in the present tense. When asked about her days, she mentioned school hours. When questioned gently about her remorse, she said only that she wished she'd done more to protect her. By fall, the prison's mental health unit had flagged her for increased observation. She'd created a kind of shrine in her cell drawings taped to the wall, a paper doll folded from commissary receipt paper, a photo of a girl she'd cut from a catalog and pinned to her pillow. She called the girl Sarah, though the name didn't match anyone connected to the case. The court had ordered therapy, but Brennan resisted deeper evaluation. Her answers stayed shallow circular. She gave only what was expected, never more. But she did start talking late at night, mostly to herself, sometimes to the nurses during checks. And when the unit psychiatrist began recording select sessions under administrative order, what surfaced in those transcripts changed how the department viewed the case entirely. She spoke of other children, not directly, not with names, but she referenced second chances. She said things like they didn't stay long or some couldn't settle. Not even after I changed the room. When asked what she meant by the room, she described colors. Paint, furniture, toys, beds moved around. She said, "You can't keep them the same. It's too noticeable." There were moments in those transcripts that read like fiction, ramblings, fragments. But buried in them were patterns. She mentioned a swing set, a different town, a boy who liked birds and left feathers under the porch. And none of that lined up with Rebecca. Chen requested a review of Brennan's work history again, this time with a different lens. Not just where she'd worked, but where she'd lived, where she'd volunteered, where she'd spent time in between jobs between counties. She found a 6-month gap in 1987. Brennan had listed personal sabbatical on one resume, but a background search showed she'd been renting a room above a laundromat in Wheeling, West Virginia. No formal work during that period, no utilities in her name, but there was a handwritten flyer in a local archive advertising childcare help posted around that time. No proof it was her. But the handwriting, when compared to the label Brennan had left on a box in her basement back in Lancaster, looked close enough for Chen to take note. There were more threads. A school in Akron where a young girl had been pulled out mid-year in 1989 after enrolling under a different name. A child services report from York, Pennsylvania, citing an overly familiar female volunteer who had shown up at a youth shelter unannounced 3 times in a single week. No charges filed, no follow-up, just notes. Chen tracked down the former staffers from those facilities, many retired, some reluctant to talk. One woman remembered Brennan clearly, said she was helpful to a fault, brought extra snacks, stayed late, took a strange interest in children who were shy or slow to speak. Another recalled that Brennan insisted on bringing handmade toys to the shelter. Dolls, mostly, always faceless. That part gave Chen pause. The same Amish-style dolls Rebecca used to carry. the kind that aren't sold in stores, the kind you don't forget once you've seen them up close. None of this was admissible, not in court, but that wasn't the goal. The goal now was to understand how far this had gone. If there were other children who'd been taken, even temporarily, even just for a few days. The legal threshold was high, but the moral weight was heavier. The doll, it turned out, held one more secret. Months after Brennan's conviction, it had been stored in evidence, tagged and preserved. During a routine audit of long-term materials, a technician noticed the stitching around the back seam had separated slightly, likely from age. Inside, wedged deep within the cotton stuffing, was a scrap of paper no bigger than a matchbox, folded tightly. It took careful work to remove it without tearing. On it, written in faint pencil, were the words, "I love you, Mama and Papa. I want to come home." The handwriting was small, childlike. The paper had yellowed, the ink had nearly faded. But it was real. They showed it to Mary Miller before it was entered into evidence. She held it in her hands without saying a word for almost a full minute. Then she folded it again very gently and gave it back to the officer. That note answered nothing, but it confirmed everything. Rebecca had tried, even in the dark, even when no one could hear her. She left behind something only she could have written. A voice that had gone quiet for 9 years, finally speaking again. And that voice, that fragment of truth, was what kept Chen going. Because whatever Margaret Brennan had claimed there was now proof that Rebecca hadn't just vanished. She'd fought to come home. And it begged the question, who else might have tried? Who else might have been waiting for someone to find them? By year's end, the state launched a full internal review of Brennan's former caseload. Multiple agencies cooperated, files were reopened, and while no new abductions were confirmed, several families came forward with stories that felt too similar to ignore. A child who was suddenly withdrawn after an outreach visit. A doll that appeared in a donation box with no tag, no receipt, just a red dress and black yarn hair. A young girl who'd described a woman she called Miss Peg, who brought her coloring books and asked if she wanted to live somewhere quieter. There were too many of these to call coincidence, but too little to prosecute. Margaret Brennan never gave names, never confirmed anything beyond Rebecca. But in therapy, when asked if she felt responsible for any other children, she paused, looked up, and said some of them were never meant to stay. I just wanted them to feel seen. She said it like it was mercy, like it made it better. But what it did really was confirm what we already suspected. Rebecca wasn't the first. And she may not have been the last. The first time the Millers heard Brennan had been released, it wasn't from the courts or the state. It was from a neighbor, someone who'd read a small notice in the back of a local paper. A clerical error had dropped the family from the victim notification registry. By then, it had already been 3 weeks. Margaret Brennan was out, quietly processed and reassigned to a probation officer in the outskirts of Allentown. She wasn't allowed within 50 miles of any Amish community. Couldn't work with children. Had to report weekly. But to Mary and Daniel, it didn't feel like supervision. It felt like abandonment. And by the time the system caught its mistake and formally reached out, the damage had already been done. There was no formal press release, no photos of Brennan walking out the prison gates, just a new address, a halfway house-style apartment building across from a freight yard. She got a job cleaning offices at night. Kept to herself. No car, no social contacts. According to her file, she stayed compliant. Passed her checks, didn't make trouble. But within 2 months, her probation officer noted signs of regression. Paranoia. Delusion. Brennan had built a new version of Rebecca in her head, a child who'd never died, who'd grown older, and was now somehow waiting for her again. She wasn't angry. She wasn't threatening. But she had slipped fully into her own narrative. They found the shrine during a surprise check-in. Second floor, single-room layout, one narrow bed pushed against the wall. But the real focus was in the corner, a desk covered in children's drawings clipped from magazines, some hand-drawn, others traced. There were dolls, 2 crude recreations, sewn by hand but unmistakable, red fabric, black yarn hair, over a dozen of them arranged like they were being watched. Brennan had labeled each one with a name, none of them Rebecca. Some were names that had come up during cold case reviews missing children from the late 80s and early 90s. Others were unfamiliar. One just read "baby from the swing." She refused treatment, refused to speak with mental health staff. Her responses grew evasive. She told her parole officer she was close to finding what she lost. That line triggered a deeper review. And when she was spotted near a public playground on a Tuesday morning watching children from a bench just outside the perimeter, it was enough to revoke her release. The arrest was quick, routine. She didn't resist. Said she just liked the way the light hit the trees when the kids were running. She denied speaking to anyone, but witnesses said she'd approached 2 girls both under 10. One said Brennan had asked about her doll. The other said Brennan offered her a ribbon. It was pink and handmade. In court, her defense pointed to delusion, not intent. They argued she hadn't harmed anyone, that she hadn't tried to flee. But the psychologist called to testify painted a more complicated picture. She described a system of internal belief Brennan had built over decades, one that allowed her to reframe what she'd done as care, not control. That shrine wasn't nostalgia. It was structure, a fantasy Brennan returned to again and again because it let her rewrite the parts she couldn't live with. The judge gave her 5 more years, this time with mandatory psychiatric placement. She was transferred to a high-security hospital with a long-term observation wing. That's where the deeper confessions started coming out, not in courtroom statements or formal interviews, but in passing conversations, shared fragments, hints. She spoke of more than Rebecca, a child from a rest stop in Ohio, a boy from a shelter who wouldn't stay quiet at night, a girl who was almost perfect but her voice didn't match. These weren't names, just pieces, distorted. Some of it might have been invention, memory twisted by illness, but there were enough consistencies across these disclosures that Chen flagged them all, submitted them to the Bureau's Missing Persons Unit for reevaluation. Still, there was no hard evidence of other abductions, no recovered bodies, no confessions that held detail beyond implication. But Brennan's old case files were full of flags, reports that hadn't been followed up, notes about her crossing boundaries, showing up unannounced, sending letters after she'd been told not to. For every official visit, there were 2 unofficial ones. For every documented hour, there were gaps. Her career had ended before mandatory reporting systems were fully digitized. That made it harder to track. But Chen kept pushing. She requested interviews with every surviving family Brennan had worked with. Most declined. Some had moved states away. Others refused out of anger, fear, or a desire to finally close that door. But 3 agreed. Quietly. Off record. One mother now in her 60s remembered Brennan bringing her daughter a gift during the holidays. It was a doll, red and black, handmade. Her daughter only had it for a week, said it gave her bad dreams, said it whispered to her. The mother never reported it, just threw the thing away and told her daughter not to talk about it anymore. Another family said Brennan offered to take their child for a weekend retreat, said it was part of a recovery bonding experience for families dealing with trauma. But when they called the agency to confirm, no one knew what she was talking about. The visit was canceled. Brennan never brought it up again. But the child, now an adult, remembered the questions Brennan had asked. Do you like quiet houses? Would you want to live somewhere with no TV? What if you could start over? Alone. These things were just stories. Nothing the department could act on. But together, they formed a shape. A pattern of closeness that strayed too far. A need for control disguised as compassion. Rebecca had been her only confirmed victim. But the signs stretched wider than that. In the final year of her sentence, Brennan's health began to decline. She was placed on medication, grew quieter, less coherent. The drawings stopped. The dolls were taken away. She began asking for someone named Sarah again. Said she was waiting outside, that she had the real one this time. When asked what she meant, she went still, repeated the same phrase 3 times. This one doesn't fight. By then, the Miller family had moved to a smaller settlement. They no longer gave interviews, no longer attended public events. The foundation they'd started quietly and without fanfare continued its work helping families of the missing. But Mary no longer spoke about Rebecca in public, not because she had forgotten, but because the world had already said enough. Sometimes remembering out loud just makes the pain louder. They kept the note the one found inside the doll, folded it into a small frame and placed it on a shelf near the front window. The handwriting had faded a little over time, but the words were still clear. I love you, Mama and Papa. I want to come home. And somehow, in those 10 words, all the rest could be left unsaid. I still think about the doll, not the ones she made afterward, not the dozens they found stitched from memory and delusion, just the first one. The one Rebecca had with her in every photo. Red cotton body, black yarn hair, 1 button eye missing. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't special to anyone but her. But somehow it was the thread that pulled the whole truth loose. I try not to hold on to symbols, but some things, they hold on to you. Margaret Brennan died just over a year into her final sentence. Natural causes, they said. Her heart gave out in the night. No visitors, no family, no final statements. Her file was sealed, and her ashes were handled by the state. For a long time, I thought that would leave the story unfinished, that if there wasn't a confession or a final moment of reckoning, then it didn't really close. But grief doesn't follow rules. It just settles into you, quiet, relentless. Mary never went to see Brennan, not once. Daniel considered it, especially after those last reports came out about the other possible children. He kept saying someone should look her in the eye, make her say it. But in the end, he stayed home. Said he didn't want his last memory of Rebecca to be filtered through the woman who took her. I understood that. I respected it. What they chose to do instead was small, simple. They planted a tree, not in a cemetery, not on any official ground, just a patch of field behind their new home. A quiet place where the wind moves through the leaves and the ground stays soft. There's no plaque, no marker, just a single red ribbon tied near the base. It fades in the sun and gets replaced every spring. The case never reopened formally. There wasn't enough to tie Brennan to other crimes not in court. But Chen kept the files. So did I. Somewhere in my garage there's still a banker's box labeled by hand Rebecca Miller. Full archive. I haven't opened it in years. I don't need to. The parts that matter are burned in. I think about what we missed. Not just the signs, but the systems that failed. The paper trails that never connected. The meetings where people nodded but didn't act. But I also think about the girl who wrote one final note with trembling hands and had the strength to hide it where someone might find it. I think about what that took, and I hope in some way she knew it worked. If you've made it this far, thank you. These stories are hard to tell and harder to carry. But silence doesn't protect anyone. Not the lost, not the grieving, not the next family looking for answers. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it so no name gets left behind.